Hello, I've tried to make these Middle English PowerPoints as self-explanatory as I can, but I think there are a few things that need expansion, and of course it helps to hear Middle English pronounced as well as seen to really give you a sense of the flavor of the language. So without further ado, here we go. In this first video, we see depicted here an image of the Bayeux Tapestry, which was an enormous piece of cloth woven in the late 11th century to commemorate the conquest of England by the Normans, which was a very important event both for English political history and for our purposes for the history of the English language, because this was when the Anglo-Saxon speaking elite were displaced by a French-speaking elite. And the effects of the language survived to this day, and they are massive. So, who were the Normans? Why did they speak French? The word Norman comes from Norsemen. It's a contraction. These were Viking raiders who, during the 700s and 800s, at the same time as the Danes were overrunning eastern England, they were overrunning northern France and many other places beside. And they were granted territory by the king of Francia, the king of the Franks, today known as France, in return for security. And they just like the Danes in England eventually started speaking English, the Vikings in France started speaking French. And they spoke their own dialect of French called Norman. The Duchy of Normandy was well-organized, powerful, and violent. They were pioneers of castle building, of cavalry techniques, and they were also a major center for a lot of the institutional reforms in the church that took place in the 11th and 12th century, making it what would become an enormous international power, political as well as spiritual power, that we associate with the medieval papacy that had a lot of patronage and support from the Normans. The Normans, from their base in Normandy here in northern France, you may have heard, if you're history buffs, you know Normandy is the place where the Allied forces invaded France during the World War II. But the Duchy of Normandy, back in the Middle Ages, they conquered not only England, but Sicily, that island to the south of Italy, southern Italy, parts of Greece, and some of the Crusader states, as they're called, such as the Principality of Antioch, were ruled by Normans. For some reason, they were just really good at kicking butt and taking names, and did so in 1066. Now, this story here shows the Battle of Stamford Bridge. In 1066, Edward the Confessor dies. He was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. He had close ties to Normandy and had, we're told, named William the Duke of Normandy as his successor. Now, of course, we need to take that with a small grain of salt because that's what the Norman sources are telling us. But the Anglo-Saxon thanes and earls and rulers instead elected Harold Godwinson, the king, because the kingship at this time in an Anglo-Saxon culture did not necessarily fall to the oldest son. Kings were elected. And immediately he was challenged by King Harold III of Norway, who apparently also had a claim to the throne, and William at the same time. So imagine you've just been elected king, yay, and then two other powers declare war on you, saying, no, I'm king. So first he goes and fights Harold Haradra at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And there's, I guess, Harold, I don't know what's going on there, but this is a depiction of that battle from a medieval manuscript, and he wins. Yay for Harold Godwinson. However, a new challenger arises. Here comes the Normandy, the William of Normandy, known in France as William the Bastard, comes with 7,000 to 8,000 men and 1,000 to 2,000 cavalry. Harold is about the same, but they're all foot soldiers. And they're also tired because he has to do a forced march down from Stamford Bridge, which is in northeastern England, all the way down to Hastings. His men are tired, and he gets arrowed, all beans. And here's a link to a video if you like corny military history videos with reenactors. I'm a fan. Anyway, the Normans win, and they take over the country, and they basically dispossess the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy of their holdings and install their own. So suddenly all the earls and dukes and and barons who had been, and what have you, who had been Old English-speaking, Germanic-speaking people from the Anglos and the Saxons are now Normans and they speak French. And so we get a situation of diglossia, where the upper elite, and at its greatest, the French-speaking elite of England was probably only ever 5 to 10% of the population at most, but they're the ones who run things. One of our interesting records of this period, of course, is the Domesday Book, and it is the great survey produced for King William of all the property. It's written in medieval Latin, but it includes some English terms that don't have Latin equivalents, and its purpose was basically who owes me taxes, and this is where the book, why it's called the Domesday Book. It doesn't have to do with like the end of the world, but Domesday means judgment, right? So Doomsday means judgment day, and we have the word deem, right? Modern English, to judge, to consider, is related. It's the verb form of the noun doom, which meant judgment. This is a lot of times we see this way of forming verbs out of nouns and nouns out of verbs is to swap around the vowel. It's a process called umlaut by historical linguists, but that's a little more technical than we'll need to get into in this class. Here's a page of the Domesday Book and a description. Then at the midwinter 1085 was the king in Gloucester with his council. After this had the king a large meeting and very deep consultation with his council about this land, how it was occupied, and by what sort of men. Then sent he his men over all England into each shire, commissioning them to find out how many hundreds of hides were in the shire, what land the king himself had, and what stock upon the land, or what dues he ought to have by the year from the shire. And what we can see from this, first of all, is that some aspects of the administrative culture of Anglo-Saxon England continued to survive. They continued to divide the land into units called shires, which from your compounding exercise you might remember as one of the sources of shire reeve, which became sheriff. And also the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles continued to be written. The monks, the monasteries became an important point of survival of Anglo-Saxon culture and written culture. And because, even if you conquer a country, even if you kick out all the political leaders and replace them with your own, even if you sort of have the bishops defrocked and replace Anglo-Saxon bishops with Norman bishops, which is what they did as quickly as they could because bishops were great landholders, you're not going to go and kill a bunch of monks, right? That's pretty bad, just from any point of view in terms of, one Christian nation going to war against another. So, and monks were often, there's a lot of institutional continuity and practice among the among monastic practice, and so and Alfred had established an enduring written culture for English, really that no other Western European language, except maybe the troubadours of Provençal, and even then, no other Western European language rivals. Everywhere else, it was only in the 12th and 13th century, and even later, that vernacular languages came into their own as written languages. But at this point, with the Normans in power, this is when, as Melvin Bragg puts it in the Adventure of English, this is when English goes underground for a while. And in our next video, we will talk about the effects of language contact between English and French.